All right, guys. It's November 8th, 2025, and this is our second report on the relentless march towards a U.S. war on Venezuela. And I'm doing this partly because I want to dispel any notion that we are anywhere near out of the woods. I still think that the likelihood of the US attacking Venezuela, specifically some kind of air campaign against government buildings and government officials, assassinations, and possibly also attacks on the oil infrastructure, is extremely likely. I think it's extremely likely and extremely bad. I'll get into some more detail about that, but the first point that I want to make tonight is that I don't think that anything that has happened since I was here 3 weeks ago has changed my assessment at all, that this is the direction that things are going. And you might argue, well, hasn't the fact that America hasn't attacked yet, isn't that some form of evidence that they're not going to attack? And the answer to that is clearly no. Whenever the US attacks a target, they do it after a long buildup, a long propaganda buildup, a long physical buildup, a long military buildup, and a series of probes, like they've been doing with these bombings in the Caribbean. As far as I know now, we're over 60. I saw 61 killed a couple of days ago, and so that is the first point. I want to call your attention to some sources. So this is what I did in the early days of the Palestine Sit Rep series, which there's 150 some of them. And I was trying in the early days, you guys remember, maybe those of you who were here for those may remember that I would try to call people's attention to good sources. So for me, really several key sources. Venezuelanalysis is definitely in the top three, maybe the number one. And here's an article from a couple days ago. Pentagon confirms decapitation strikes for Venezuela as Armada builds. It looks, sounds, and moves like a war. It's a forward posture aimed at breaking the Bolivarian Republic's resistance and installing a pliant pro-US order in Caracas. So it describes what's being built up there. And 61, this is where I saw the 61, 14 US and naval strikes have killed 61 people, many unidentified fishermen, not combatants. So that's a key source. I would say if I'm gonna name three for you to follow this developing conflict, this buildup towards the war, I would say number one, number two, and number three. And I don't want to say which one is which, but these are all three really good. Orinoco Tribune is another one. They cover lots of issues, but they will consistently be covering Venezuela. They cover all of Latin America and beyond. But we have millions of Venezuelans join volunteer militias. Venezuela seizes 64 tons of drugs this year without killing anyone. A little bit tongue-in-cheek, but also completely true. Russia suggests U.S. look for drug traffickers among its own elite. Death toll to 69. So yesterday there was a strike that I didn't catch. 5 more civilians. U.S. aircraft carrier rumored to intend to attack Venezuela. So all of these are very recent, very cutting edge articles on the Venezuela build up. And the third on my list, not the third on my list, you guys know what I mean. But a third source, we have Venezuelanalysis, Orinoco, and this one would be a key one as well. Kawsachun. Is that the right one? Maybe I should direct you more to a person. And the person I want to direct you to is Camila. Camila Press on Twitter. And Camila will be covering this. Really has been covering this constantly and is covering this really well. So make sure that you follow Camila on this, and Kawsachun News is the site. But you can follow the site and also Camila herself. So make sure that you follow those. I would say those three. If you keep up with those three, you'll be able to keep up with what's going on pretty well. Now, I want to, yes, okay. So while we're on the topic of resources, let me give you, if you want to not just follow ongoing events, but catch up on the history, there are, I would say, two key books that I would want you to read. That are the first two books that I would want people to read if they're trying to catch up and figure out what Venezuela is. What is Venezuela? What is this Venezuela that the Americans are trying to attack? And what is and why? And those two books are specifically on Venezuela. There's a book called In the Shadow of the Liberator by, it's actually by, I think, an Englishman named Richard Gott. And Richard Gott has a book called In the Shadow of the Liberator, Hugo Chavez and the Transformation of Venezuela. It's 25 years old. He's talking a lot about what Hugo Chavez wanted to do. And over the course of the 10 or 13 years since the book, Hugo Chavez went on to do a lot of what he wanted to do, and also to, of course, face sanctions and brutal coup attempts and a general strike and an attempt to destroy the oil industry, all of those things, but also to accomplish a lot of what Chavez was trying to do. And what, I'll spoil it for you, even though I am not going to desist from recommending this book, but to spoil it for you, Chavez wanted to build an alliance of countries of the Americas for sovereignty, for development, and for South-South connections, a so-called Bolivarian alliance. Wanted to do something called sow the oil. So the idea that the oil that Venezuela had would become the fund for development so that you could transcend dependence on oil. So use the oil to get past the oil. And also a cultural transformation so that Venezuela wouldn't be so, think that the United States was the be all and end all, but instead, Richard Gott has this quote about like Venezuelans need to eat arepas and need to, remember that arepas are delicious and not hamburgers, that beans and, pabellon criollo is delicious and not fried chicken and fries, right? So it's like there's the culture, like rescuing the culture, the diverse indigenous cultures, Afro-Venezuelan culture, Venezuela, South America, the global South, connections between these countries, diplomacy, sovereignty, development, sowing the oil. Those are the planks of Chavismo. And Maduro, who succeeded Chavez and was elected several times after Chavez died in 2013, follows Chavismo as well. So I'd recommend that book. It was recommended to me by some Chavistas in 2002, and I still think it's one of the best books to just get a handle on what the Chavismo project is in Venezuela. And the second resource I would say that I would recommend to everybody, and again, you don't have to read them in this order, is called, your drum roll please, The Open Veins of Latin America. And The Open Veins of Latin America has a pretty special history because it's a book that Hugo Chavez tried to give Barack Obama when they met, and you can see how uncomfortable Obama is and how amused Chavez is. Chavez was always trying to get people to read things. Chavez, if you ever watch Chavez's television program or watch Chavez give a speech, you would see he's always recommending books. He's always recommending readings, authors, and this was the first thing that he did. He went over to Barack Obama and he handed Obama The Open Veins of Latin America by Eduardo Galeano. And The Open Veins of Latin America by Eduardo Galeano is like it's basically, again, the single most important book you could read if you wanted to understand Latin America. If you want to understand Africa, I would say Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. If you want to understand Latin America, I would say it's Eduardo Galeano, The Open Veins of Latin America. So those are the two books that I would recommend, and those are the three resources that I would recommend. Now, let me also go over a little bit of my impressions of a couple of weeks ago now. There was an interview, a 2-hour-long interview of Gustavo Petro, the Colombian president, by a Colombian journalist named Daniel Coronel on Univision. So Coronel is, judging by the questions, he's on the right wing of the spectrum. And I shouldn't say questions, because the question that Coronel was asking Petro over and over again was, your stance on Gaza has angered Trump, and now Colombians are in trouble with the emperor because of that stance. So what are you going to do basically to fix it? Are you going to apologize? Are you going to back off? Can you stop getting Colombia in trouble? Millions of Colombians are going to pay the price of you being anti-genocide at the United Nations. And that was over and over again. I mean, there were some other equally stupid questions. There was a truly stupid question about Venezuela where he said, how can you be nice to Maduro and mean to Maria Corina Machado? And for the most part, Petro, I thought, handled all of these questions pretty well, including the very stupid ones and the very cowardly one that was repeated over and over. So I'm gonna, without going over the questions again and again, although Coronel's question is a good kind of indication of the servile mentality and of the kind of psychology of the people that the Americans are looking for in Venezuela too, when they look for collaborators. So all of this, military buildup is real. It is real. And it is absolutely deadly. They've killed 70 people, just surprise attacks on fishermen and fishing boats. But it is also theatrical and it is also psychological. And the idea is to try to get people in Venezuela to crack under the pressure and go and try to overthrow Maduro for the Americans, because they feel like the Americans are going to come and they're going to destroy their country. And if they could save their country by handing their country over to the Americans without a fight, then that could spare the country. And that's kind of what Coronel was doing. He was saying, look, you're getting us in trouble by being anti-genocide. If you could be quiet about the genocide, then Colombia might have not get in trouble in their trade deals with America. So can you stop, etc. Anyway, Petro, though, managed to put a number of important things onto the table. So one of them, he talked about the history of Colombia, the history of the left in Colombia, of which he was a part. There was a whole history of a war in Colombia. There's, in theory, a peace in Colombia now, as of 10, 12 years ago. But the war had started arguably in 1948 or 1964, depending on how you count. And in 1980, there was a peace deal, the 1980s. And a lot of these guerrilla fighters formed a political party called the Unión Patriótica, the Patriotic Union. And they kind of went out into open politics and were massacred. It was like a real political genocide. It was thousands of them, maybe 3,000 or more people that were assassinated over the course of less than a decade, who in politics. So it's one of those unimaginable things that happens in other, in a place where you try to imagine what that would be like to have 3,000 political figures in a big country being assassinated. Like every couple days, somebody's getting, some high profile politician of the left is getting assassinated. And Petro is like one of the survivors of this, and he talks about how the US was always on the side of the people doing the assassinating, right? And then there's a section where he talks about where Petro also takes advantage of the questioning to talk about how the drug issue actually works. So it's addiction in the north, it's displacement and agricultural, I guess, dysfunction of the agricultural economy in the global south. It's these kind of permitted corrupt criminal networks and banks in the global north. So he kind of breaks down how the drug trade actually works, which is in a short interview, in a model. It's an understanding that I, again, am very familiar with because Colombian leftists all know this. And it's one of the specialties, I would say, of the Colombian left, is like understanding a lot about the global drug war and the global drug trade and the way that it's actually another imperialist imposition. It's, the coca leaf is a leaf that was grown in the Andes for medicinal and, like food reasons, and then supercharged into this and made illegal, all by the same people who then developed this entire trade and use it to finance their covert assassination and regime change operations, and also ban it, and also then use it as a pretext to murder people and do further regime change operations. And Petro just, in the course of like a short time, shows a little map in a book and describes how it actually works. And that's pretty cool. He does that in the first half hour. He has a whole critique of the petroleum economy. And like, fair enough, whatever. I think it's a little unfair to Venezuela, but he talks about how Venezuela didn't, I guess, succeed in sowing the oil the way they wanted to. He doesn't put it that way. He says, their dependency on oil is a real critique that I have, and I've told Maduro this. And Trump is trapped in the past because Trump is trying to go get oil, and oil isn't the fuel of the future. So all of this is interesting and environmental, and Petro's very green in his discussion. And he answers the question of, like, the interviewer says, what about all these millions of Venezuelans who came to Colombia since 2015 or so? And Petro says, again, good answers. Petro says, basically, I don't see them. I see it a little differently. I see these people as una riqueza, he says, like wealth. Like they are, and he calls them like Colombia Venezuelans. He's like the, Colombia Venezuelans on the border. So I said this in the last report, like Colombia and Venezuela is basically the same people. And he recognized that, and he used that word, and he was talking about the border region, and he was like, of course I'm going to work with Maduro on to help the people of this region, which we're both jointly responsible for. Later on in the second hour, he talks again about Haiti, about the role of Haiti in the drug trade. Again, Haiti being a completely US controlled and occupied space, and also a transshipment point. So this is not a coincidence, and it's not like oh my God, how can this be that all of the areas that the Americans control are the actual areas where the drugs seem to be coming from? It's impossible. It can't be true. But it's working exactly by design. It's working exactly the way it's supposed to work. And Petro understands this. He talks about it in a way that shows that he understands it. There's a clip that went viral where he says, how stupid would it be for Colombia to participate in an American war on our own relatives, in Venezuela. He calls them our cousins, basically, nuestros primos in Venezuela. And he then when he gets into the drug, a lot of this is about drugs, and then he's like, the same way that petroleum is the fuel of the past, he's like, cocaine is also the drug of the past. Cocaine was the drug of the 80s. Cocaine was the drug of the 90s. It's the drug of the past because it was a capitalist drug. It was he was around a 1 hour and 49-minute mark. He says it's a capitalist drug, and the whole point of cocaine is like it amps you up. You're able to work and work and work and work. And now in 2025, people are tired. People are tired and they want to kill themselves. And how you kill yourself with a drug is fentanyl. And that's why fentanyl is the drug of the present. Fentanyl is the drug, and it's produced in the United States. And you can't blame China for the precursors, chemicals, precursor chemicals that can be made into all kinds of things. The labs, the fentanyl is being made in the US, and people are killing themselves with it because the US is a society that tries to kill you. Through any number of ways. It is a society where the culture, the medicine, the industry, the workplace, the police, the schools, school shooters, the gun industry, the illegal narcotics trade are all trying to kill you. And they're trying to kill everybody, actually. They're trying to kill everybody in the world, and they're especially trying to kill the Palestinians in Gaza, which Petro deals with a number of times in the interview too. And he doesn't back off. He's like, I called the genocide a genocide. I have the right to speak at the United Nations. And he basically bulldozes the interviewer. He does some really good, I think, really moving things. He talks about the beginning of the Colombian War in 1948, La Violencia, what it was called, when the leader of the Liberal Party, his name was Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, and he was assassinated on the street. Again, political assassination right on the street in Bogota. Fidel Castro was apparently in Bogota at the time, and that began a civil war in Colombia, 1948. And Petro pointed out that this was like around the same time as one of the major massacres of the Nakba, the Deir Yassin massacre, and he talks about who did it, and he connects them, and he's kind of Coronel is obviously like a Zionist, a Jewish Zionist, and Petro various points is like, you probably know about this because of your you come from this community. And he mentions Hannah Arendt, and he's like, you probably know about Hannah Arendt because of your background. It's a very funny the way that it's a very familiar way that he talks to the interviewer too. And David and Goliath, Einstein, there's a whole bunch of these. And the ending, which again has become really famous, Coronel's like, look, you got to deal with Trump, right? Like, what are you going to do? You're going to have to go and deal with Trump. So how are you going to give him what he wants? What are you going to do? And Petro was like, well, nothing's going to work unless Trump changes. And he was like, well, you can either, hopefully, it's the easy way where Trump changes his mind, but otherwise it'll be up to the American people, and they'll have to he's like, they'll have to get rid of Trump. And he does this little snap. So it was a very very dramatic ending to a definitely worthwhile interview to listen to. So now I want to do one more thing about the drug, just to kind of put to rest the drug issue. You guys probably remember I probably mentioned before that Joe Emersberger and I did an article on our Substacks talking about how the Venezuela drug story was invented completely out of whole cloth. They didn't even used to try to claim that Venezuela was a drug place of drugs until just a few years ago. Up until now, they were talking about procedural democracy. But I guess the idea of this buildup is drugs. And I always show this graphic because of the thickness of the line indicates how many trips are being made to ship Colombian product, Ecuadorian product via Guatemala, Mexico. There's some other routes, but this is the real route here. And you can see the thinness of the lines from Venezuela by comparison. And yet Venezuela is a drug place, not the place that receives the drugs, not the place that pays for the drugs or profits from the drugs or runs its entire society, millions and millions of jobs for police and jailers and states and governments off of this, and criminals as well. Or maybe that was repeating myself. So just to dispense finally with this drug question, there was a story about a week ago now on Drop Site where there's just a really funny line here in this article. It was by Grimm and someone else, and they said, Lindsey Graham says, we're going to blow them up and kill all the people who want to poison America, blah, blah, blah. Trump, it's time for him to go. And then there was this great line where it says, the trouble is most of the targets are in Mexico and Colombia, not Venezuela. The trouble is, Yes, there. The problem, however, in the wake of the meeting, the intelligence community was tasked with coming up with a more tangible list of targets on land. The problem, however, was that because of Venezuela's lack of significant involvement in the drug trade, the sites were largely in Colombia and Mexico, although they did include some small sites along the Colombia-Venezuela border, a zone relatively not under state control, where coca growing flourishes. So, again, historically, in the areas that were under American, control, where America had bases, like places like Colombia, Bolivia, the Americans did all kinds of horrific things to peasants. They would spray them with glyphosate, with poison. They would spray their fields with poison. They would say, they wouldn't consult them, or they would go and eradicate their crops. And aerial fumigation, just fumigating people. And this obviously enraged peasants in Colombia. And I met some of these peasants in Colombia who had been attacked in this way, chemical warfare against peasants. But again, this is way worse. This is just like military assault on fishing boats. And presumably what they're planning in Venezuela is just straight out military assault, starting with the air. So now I just want to talk about the military situation. And there's a lot of smoke, not a lot of really solid signal, but I think we can fairly say that Venezuela has some defense capability, that they have some Russian and other weapon systems. They're not dependent on American systems. They have the S-300 air defense system. I think it works as a system. It's going to work as a system. So that is something that is, I'm sure, giving the Americans pause in terms of they don't necessarily know what's going to happen. I'm sure they would love to do a bunch of runs with their stealth aircraft and take out that air defense system and show off to the world that they can take out the S-300, which would also be pretty humiliating to Russia if they can pull that off. So I would say, like, that's probably a goal, but also a fear of theirs. We know they have, speaking of Russian equipment, they have the Sukhoi aircraft. They have Chinese aircraft, I think. There was a Latin American YouTuber that I watched a video of. Again, I have no idea how much I can verify, but they, this guy was arguing, based on watching a Venezuelan television program, that Venezuela has the best air defense in Latin America, which is not impossible because most of Latin America would be allied, or a vassal of the Americans, and the Americans would not want their allies to have air defense. For what? The only conceivable air defense, air attack that any of these countries could face would be from the Americans. And why would the Americans want them to have air defense? So it could very well be that Venezuela is the only country that had the resources to do it, that has the reason to do it, and that has been out of US control for long enough to be able to do it. So these armaments are there. Now, the other thing, of course, that Venezuela has is their army, which is, as far as I can tell, loyal. The last time there was a military coup to overthrow Chavez was in 2002, and that was 23 going on 24 years ago. And we are, I am certain that every minute of those 24 years, if the Americans could have orchestrated another coup, they would have, and we would have seen at least a coup attempt. So I think the Venezuelan military has been several generations out from that coup attempt, and the senior people in that military now are people who have been promoted, risen through the ranks as Chavistas in a Chavista context. And the Chavista context, I don't know how much of this is in Richard Gott, but it is based on a civil military cooperation model that is not the norm. So the military in Venezuela is not feared. Far from it. The military in Venezuela, by the people, I mean, is just like understood to be like of the people, and you'll see them doing all kinds of projects. You'll see them, of course, engaged in training and defense, but they're defending against ultimately an American invasion, but often it takes the form of attack via Colombia, which is why the Colombia-Venezuela border region is so volatile and such a thing to watch, and why Petro not playing along with the Americans has been so important. And when Petro goes in less than a year, as Coronel gleefully reminded him that he's going to be going in a year, less than a year, 10 months or something, presumably to be replaced by an ultra right winger who will cooperate with the regime change campaign against Venezuela. So that's a risk for then. But for now, the short term, we're looking at this naval building up to air attack, and there's this potential issue that the Americans could face in the form of U.S. air defense. And on the ground, the Venezuelan army is loyal. I don't know how well equipped they are in terms of fighting the Americans, but I imagine in terms of infantry equipment, they're probably just fine. And I think their numbers are pretty high. Their morale is pretty high. They know what they're fighting for. They know what the stakes are. And so I think they're going to do fine if the Americans invade. The Americans have like 16,000 troops. If the Colombians don't join, which they won't, the prospect of an invasion is very dubious. It is very dubious. I just don't see it. So the hope would always be that they would get the army to defect, or some faction of the army to defect, or some province to defect. Some states are anti-Chavez, but none of that is looking like very promising for the American side. And besides the army, you've probably all heard the civil military cooperation model. There are militias, and essentially everybody in Venezuela is armed at this point. There are like 8 million people carrying arms ready to defend Venezuela. So that is not something the Americans are going to want any part of in terms of trying to fight a ground war. Again, decapitation strikes, air attack is another story, and I don't think that, I see that as being very, very difficult to avoid. Hopefully there's a thin edge, razor's edge way out of this. But, what the Americans are hoping for in terms of a coup or a local collaborators, I think they've been hoping that would materialize this whole time. And when they bomb, if they bomb, they're going to hope that it materializes after the bombing. And it's even less likely to emerge after they bomb. So what paradigms are they looking at? And that's kind of like where I'm going to close tonight's sit rep. There's, in terms of American recent, like we have 100 years ago, right? We have the invasions of Nicaragua and Dominican Republic and Haiti 100 years ago, Guatemala, I guess, like all of Central America was invaded and occupied by the Americans in the interwar period. And I'll cover that in the historical podcast. But in terms of recent, like the half century, there's Grenada, which was a very small island compared to Venezuela, with a revolutionary government, which was attacked by Reagan, I believe in 1984, bombed and invaded. And that was pretty much 1983, pretty much a walkover by the Americans. But Grenada's very small. They had an army of 1,300 troops. They had Cuban support, but this is not Venezuela 2025 is not comparable to Grenada in 1983. And then Panama, also completely different invasion in 1989. But this is, you can tell from the rhetoric that this is somehow what's on their minds, is trying to reproduce Panama 1989. They're saying Maduro's a drug trafficker, and they said Manuel Noriega was a drug trafficker, and they invaded with 30,000 American troops, which I think the Americans would be hard pressed to put together a force of 30,000 troops to invade a country in the Americas today. It was pretty easy to do then, and that was just before they invaded Iraq as well. And I'm going to get to Iraq now, or Syria. But in terms of the Americas, that's what we have. We have Grenada and we have Panama, and neither of those is a very good, like if you're the American planners of this attack, and you look at Grenada and Panama, and then you look at a map of Venezuela, and you look at an org chart of the Venezuelan military, and you look at the armaments, you're going to realize pretty fast that this is not the same kind of problem as Grenada or Panama, Grenada 1983 or Panama 1989. So then what they presumably will look to is the Middle East, where they've had more success, where Iraq and then Syria. So Iraq, they bombed in 1991. They essentially destroyed the army. But they were destroying the army as it was retreating from Kuwait. And they decided not to invade Iraq in 1991 precisely because they thought the cost would be pretty high. So then they spent the next 12 years destroying Iraq's economy through sanctions. And then in 2003, they finally invaded. And again, the Iraqis somehow agreed not to fight. There was some kind of thing where they didn't really have a battle ever with the Iraqis. And, the state was exhausted. The economy was devastated. And the idea was that the Americans might bring some kind of relief from that situation. And obviously, Iraq today is almost as destroyed as it's ever been. And all of the money of Iraq is still under the control of the Americans. The oil revenue goes to an American account. So the Venezuelans who are thinking of delivering their country from this terrible situation that it's in right now under Chavismo should realize that the oil money will be going to an American. Again, they don't care. I mean, traders are not motivated by genuinely trying to save their countries. But Iraq and Syria is another case where they kind of found the allies to start a civil war and eroded the state capacity over a decade, right? A decade and a half, 2011 to 2024 when it finally fell. But they had Turkey, they had Israel, whatever kind of deal they struck with Russia, and presumably there's some negotiation with Russia over Venezuela too right now. Russia is always willing to sell their weapons, but Venezuela is not a priority for them, and they will abandon their allies if they can get the right price from the West, right? So they are under all this pressure in Ukraine. They have a special relationship with Israel, and so it'll be a question of like, what will you give us to abandon Venezuela, presumably. But Venezuela has a really good, unbreakable ally in Cuba, and Cuban intelligence has been instrumental in foiling so many of these plots. And so Iraq and Syria will also be hard to apply, because so much of the work, the hard work, the heavy lifting, and the dying in Iraq and Syria, so in order for the destruction of these states to take place, was done by local forces in cooperation, the ISIS, local creations, local forces cooperating with or produced in these gulags, these prisons that the Americans create. And they are the actual personnel that fought and created these regime changes. And so Venezuela has not done that for them, and neither has Colombia. Colombia just hasn't come through for them the way that they hoped. Even under right-wing administrations, I have to admit this, Petro has been great on this way. But even right-wing, when it was Duque, who was fundamentally an Uribe follower, like on the right, the ultra-right of Colombia, they still didn't want to go and get their army in a big battle in a big war with Venezuela. Even they didn't see the upside of these two countries, these two big countries with big economies and big populations, and having to live as neighbors, the same culture, like I keep saying, having to live as neighbors for the foreseeable future. If the planet has a future, why should they get into a war because the Americans want to pick who gets to be the government there? So I think there's no military option for victory in the sense of regime change. What we are talking about is an American air campaign where they try to shake things up and create chaos and destroy some of Venezuela's state capacities, which then make sanctions hurt more, and maybe delegitimize and maybe isolate Venezuela, and maybe try to break off their connection, their supply of weaponry from Russia, or their economic links with China. And that's I guess that's the last thing. Let me just conclude with this, because if people were asking me why now, like what is motivating the Americans to be trying to pick up fight with Venezuela in this hemisphere now, while they're also genociding in Gaza and starting a war with Lebanon, maybe, and starting another war with Iran, and maybe continuing the war on the Russia-Ukraine war. Like what are they doing? Why pick a fight with Venezuela? Venezuela's just there. They're not doing anything. Well, the history, Joe Emersberger and me have a book called Extraordinary Threat, where we talk about 20 years, it was from 5 years ago now, the book, but it was 20 years of trying to overthrow Venezuela, right? 20 years of coup attempts in Venezuela. And now it's 25. And so from when the Bolivarian Revolution happened, the Americans have been continuously trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela. They've been trying to continuously overthrow the government of Cuba since 1959. They've been trying to overthrow when the left comes into power by elections in Brazil. They try to overthrow them. They're more or less trying to overthrow Lula, even though he kind of sucks on this Venezuela issue and on Gaza, like, you know, whatever, even though he's not great, and even though he participated in the occupation of Haiti last time he was in power, they still regime changed him. You know, you don't have to be Maduro to be a target of regime change. So even though you know, you can have the softest left-wing leader, the Americans will try to overthrow them. If you have a leadership or a government or a process, they like to call it in Latin America, a proceso, they call it a process, like a revolutionary process. If you have a process like the one in Venezuela, which is trying to empower and develop and you know, has this civil military cooperation model, this America's integration, the idea of integrating the Americas and the markets in the Americas, and sovereignty, which is sovereignty in Latin America, is an anti-US bias, right? The only people that infringe on Latin American sovereignty are the US. So if you say you're for Latin American sovereignty, the Americans will hear that as you are anti-US, and they're not wrong. So that process, if you have a process like that, then you're gonna really, the Americans are really gonna want to overthrow you. And so they have tried coups, they've tried to create a national strike, they've tried sanctions, and these things have been foiled. The sanctions in particular are in the process of being foiled, and that's thanks to the decoupling. That's thanks to the Americans being so vigorous in trying to exclude China and Russia and create this huge list of countries that have sanctions on them. So you have countries with tons of natural resources that are sanctioned, and then you have countries that have manufacturing ability to make everything in the world that are being sanctioned. And so they find each other and trade with each other, and then you've just sanctioned yourself without realizing it. And that's what's happened. It's taken decades, but by surviving these decades, Venezuela is now in a position where their economy can recover, and where they will be able to, from this point on, with the Chinese relationship, they're going to be a country in the Americas that can prosper without having an American, in spite of the Americans trying to sanction them. And Cuba will be a part of this, and then other countries might look to do this, which they have, right? Honduras tried to do a Chavista thing and were overthrown, and Paraguay was overthrown. There were all these countries that were overthrown since the coup in Venezuela that lasted 48 hours. There were coups. Bolivia had a coup. There were tons of coups. And Ecuador had some equivalent of a coup. So there are coups galore. But you could see this example. If the Venezuelan economy were to emerge from the sanctions process and start developing and possibly even thriving, well, then you're going to, that's going to really freak out the US. And I think that is fundamentally why the US is looking at trying to start a war. So it's because all of these other options have been foiled. Coup has been foiled, national strike has been foiled, and now sanctions are in the process of being foiled. So what they haven't tried is just bombing. If they try bombing, hopefully the bombing plan can be foiled before the bombing happens. That would be ideal. I hope it does. I hope it does. So I will, I'll be here. I will continue to report on this, and as there are new developments. I think owe you guys a Gaza Sit Rep too, because there are things worth commenting on. There are speeches that have come out from Abdel Malik al-Houthi that I think people that are saying a lot, and even some of our favorites like Laith Marouf and Mohammed Morandi. I've been watching their interviews, and they've been making some really good analytic points that have inspired me to think of a few thoughts that I'll share with you. I'm not sure when. It could be a whole week. It could be less, but until then, hang in there. We'll see you in the next one.